About a year ago now, I moved into this apartment. It was cheap, and subsequently the only thing I could afford at the time. Deep in the heart of Columbus, I found it. It was run down and ugly, much like myself. I had fallen in with a group of people while younger who pressured me into the wrong things. I became an addict, seemingly overnight, and found myself with little to nothing when I finally pulled myself away from that nightmare. In the apartment, wallpaper peeled at the edges, revealing brown stains underneath. The counters were destroyed and the appliances were all but bundles of broken glass, metal, and circuits. If you couldn't guess already, it was a foreclosure. Cheaper than I could possibly imagine. Too good to be true. Famous last words. I started with the appliances. You can't live somewhere without appliances. I gutted everything I could, left the place a husk of its once former glory, and began to slowly renovate it. It took time. Lots of it. I started with the essentials. A stove, a microwave. Months went by, and I had finally scrounged enough to the rest of what I needed. While I was working on that, I began to strip every wall in this 2-bedroom apartment of its filthy old wallpaper. I washed the walls as well as I could and began to put up the new paper. A delightful floral print I had selected for my room. A good omen, I hoped. It was nice once it was all done. It finally felt like home. Things were fine for a few months after that. Maybe a lull to me into a false sense of security. I don't really know. But they were fine. As they say, I lived, I laughed, and I sure loved. I woke up one morning to find a stain on my roof. Directly above my bed. It appeared as a water stain, which as a kid I always thought was a coffee stain from the brown edges it would create. I had fun thinking, back then, of all the ways people could throw their coffee onto the ceiling. It wasn't tremendous. However, the stain was small. Almost a pinpoint. I knew it had appeared overnight because I spent hours upon hours cleaning every inch of this place. Especially my room, which is my sanctuary, my safe place. Or, at least it was. I climbed on top of my bed and examined the dot. It appeared as though it really was just a small water stain. I didn't want to take chances, so I called the plumber. After all the work I put in, I would be damned if a leaky pipe from my upstairs neighbor would ruin it now. When he arrived, he examined the area, used some fancy plumber tech, and ultimately determined that there was no leak. Perhaps it was condensate that had settled into a low spot and thus creating the dot. I was relieved, but still on a bit edge. I could not let this place fall back into disarray. I could not let myself fall back into disarray either. That night, I fell into one of the deepest slumbers I've ever experienced. One of which was so deep, and the dream so real, you feel like you're awake. Funny how that works, right? At 1 a.m. I was jostled awake. That feeling of falling when you're laying on your bed, it ripped me from my peaceful sleep. The one thing that kept me away from the stress and plummeted me back onto my uncomfortable and thin, but warm, bed. My eyes sprung open and the first thing I saw, right where that water stain was, is what appeared to be an eye. Fear wrapped its long tendrils around me. I felt it lace its way around my throat and make my eyes water. I couldn't move. My initial thought was sleep paralysis. I've had it once before, but nothing to this extent. I tried to peel my body from my bed, but no amount of sheer willpower could force it. Instead, I told myself this was but a dream and stared directly into the stain. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could clearly see what it was, my initial reactions rang true, and an eye stared back at me. Not just any eye. A dead one. The eye was glazed over and didn't blink. A silver tinge took hold of what once appeared as a deep blue eye. I waited for the dream to fade, and it felt like forever. A drop of water landed on my face. It felt wholly real, and that's when I realized the eye was crying. After a few hours of staring at this thing in my ceiling, I had finally fallen asleep again. Not out of comfort, but the fact that the sheer adrenaline that coursed through my veins ran out and my body had become far too exhausted. When I regained consciousness, I didn't want to open my eyes. I was terrified of what I might see. I could tell the sun was shining. An orange tint filled the void my eyelids had claimed over my eyes. My face felt wet, but I couldn't tell if it was due to my own sweat from the thought of that crying dead eye staring at me, or if it was truly the tears that pooled in the divot of my neck. I waged a war with myself on whether or not I should open my eyes, and my better conscience lost. My eyes sprung open, and to my surprise, there was no eye in my ceiling. But the water stain had remained. Throughout the day, I had a deepening sense of paranoia that made its way into my brain. It was as if whatever creature that eye had been attached to was breathing down my neck and always just slightly out of view. Time rolled on, and there were no signs of the eye. Not a single damn thing happened. To the point I chalked it up to a new and worse case of sleep paralysis. Maybe I had a strange phobia of eyes. Who knows? People are strangely scared of the ocean. What I wouldn't do to give myself up to that sprawling emptiness now. After the incident with the eye, a new peculiar happening took place in my lovely sanctuary. Now, let me preface that I had had several battles with my own inner demons. I was an addict and lived my life one pill or needle at a time. Or a plethora at a time, rather. Since finding peace in myself and my life, I had found counseling to be a great boon to me. That's partly why I got this place. It was really one of the only options my credit could hold without needing a cosigner, and one of the last opportunities to prove to myself and others that I was capable of being what they would call a real human being. Unfortunately, all those bridges burned down years ago, and yet I'm still reminded of those smoldering remains every day. The incident in question makes me sound like those drugs I abused so many years ago still linger in my veins and make my sanity a tightrope of bad decisions and cold, sleepless nights. I began to hear whispers coming from the vents, the windows, the sink, the toilets, the sounds of a faint call from beyond. The sounds of sloshing and what sounded like a crunch and tearing of a knife through a loaf of bread. This incident did not stop. It was a constant barrage of tiny sounds. It blended in with the background after about a week. The eye returned sometimes, still crying when it did. It racked me with fear every time it returned. It always seemed as though it would stare straight through me, deep into the ground below me, through the 4 floors of the apartment complex, and deep, deep into the ground. I could tell when it appeared regardless of how heavily asleep I was. It was that feeling of being watched, where no matter what you do, you have to check, and every time I got that feeling, I saw it there. One of the few phenomena that I truly believe only humans can feel. The final incident happened a week ago now. It's something I won't soon forget. I was invited out with a bunch of friends, a little party. Who am I to say no to a good time? By the time I had arrived home, it was late, and I was no more than a little tipsy. Save for my cab driver, it appeared as though the whole complex was asleep. Not a single light left on anywhere. Not that I could see, at least. It seemed odd to me that not even one other person was awake at this time. It wasn't terribly late. Say, maybe 1 a.m.? The halls were equally as quiet. A few snores here and there emanating from some apartments. I reached the door to my place and entered. A warm glow came from the light above my stove. It made my home feel welcoming and happy. A far cry from the real thing. I had placed my bag down and taken off my shoes, making myself comfortable once again. As I poured a glass of water from the tap, I heard the sounds again. The whispering and the bread crunching and cutting sounds. This time, however, they were louder than ever before. More visceral. I began to turn all the lights on, and that's when I realized the sound was coming from down the hall. I walked slowly towards it, and it got louder and louder and louder. It was then that I saw it. The sounds all began to make sense. The reason why this place was a foreclosure in the first place. There was something here. Something that lived here before any of us. It was a tall, very pale, gaunt-looking man. Ribs cracked in wrong directions, but somehow were still kept under the skin. The ribcage looked bloated and painful. The skin was flabby, but there was no fat, just excess skin. I stood as I watched it saw through the skin with a knife. The crunchy sound I had heard so many times before was clear. It was sawing chunks of its flesh off and stuffing it down the sink. A thick ooze seeped out of its freshly cut wounds. It didn't appear as blood, but like a vicious brown liquid that could happily stain a white roof. Something a child could imagine was coffee, perhaps. I think it realized it was being watched. And it was at that moment that I realized the feeling of being watched is not an entirely human element. It was then that I realized how wrong I had been my entire life. It turned around to face me. One singular dead eye sat in the middle of its forehead, tears running down its mouth. A vertical slice that wheezed and whispered. Its maw constantly flapped slowly as the sound slipped through. Sharp teeth that grew in all different directions encased its vile gullet. I think I had scared it like I had walked in on it and its private dealings. It appeared shocked for a moment and then leapt into action. It charged for me. I grabbed the closest thing to me that I could find, a vase on a side table, and hucked it at the thing. It didn't seem to faze it whatsoever. It was desperate to latch itself on me, as though it itself was a secret that couldn't be released into the world. It dove as I was reaching my front door and managed to grab my ankle. It had stubby hands that appeared almost as if they belonged to a doll rather than a living creature, much less one of this stature. From one of those doll-like hands, a set of claws had painfully shot through the fingertips. A horrifying mixture of a cat and Wolverine. They tore into my thigh. I had managed to grab hold of one of the high heels I had haphazardly tossed aside when I came home and threw it at the thing with a surge of rage. For once, I believe Lady Luck was on my side. The high heel had struck the creature in its eye. The creature heaved back and began to roll around on the floor. The horrifying and mind-numbing whispers came faster and louder until I had to cut my ears out of pain. I began to hear crying. It continued to writhe on the ground in pain and what appeared to be sadness, as if it had lost a game and was throwing a tantrum. I rushed out through my door and down into the street. I screamed for what, again, felt like an eternity for help, but nothing came. When I reached what I felt was a safe enough distance from that wretched place, I realized I still had my phone on me. I called whoever would listen. That, unfortunately, only ended up being the police. When they arrived, I explained, through my hysterics, what had happened. He sent some officers to check my apartment out, and when they had come back out, their looks were horrified, but not the same type of horror as I had felt. No existential dread. No battle with everything I thought I knew. They looked at me in horror. Cuffs were placed on me. They stated it was for my own safety. I had heard this far too often. It never meant it was for my safety. It was for their safety. An ambulance had arrived, and as they loaded me into the police cruiser, I was afraid of what was happening, but glad that I was being taken somewhere. Anywhere but here. As we pulled away from that lowly apartment complex on... I saw paramedics wheel the body of a tall, lanky, and disfigured man out of the building. I didn't get a good look at him, but I could tell you one thing. He looked like a normal human. I never returned to that apartment again. I never returned anywhere, actually. I've been here, in prison, a place I vowed to stay out of after escaping a life filled with drugs. A rat in a cage once more. The wound that had been on my thigh had disappeared, save for a small mark that appeared like a coffee stain on my skin. I tried to vouch that it wasn't there before, but no one was willing to listen. They all told me it was my birthmark. Don't you think I would know my own skin? I tried to call my parents, but everyone thought I was back on drugs. No help came. Eventually, I was charged with the torture and murder of one Carl F. Donaldson, whom I found out to be the man identified in my apartment. Let me be as clear as possible. That was no man, and I did no such crime. The lawyer that did try to help me did the only thing that seemed available: plead insanity. When once therapy was a saving grace for me and something I looked forward to, now I was poked and prodded at by doctors and therapists of all kinds for hours a day. My skin became brittle and cracked over time. Doctors chalked it up to an advanced form of eczema, but I had never seen it this bad. I guess it's not all bad here. I get fed 3 times a day, and I get exercise. I just wish that they would give me something other than these dull plastic knives. I think I can cut this dry stuff off. I really want to try. I pick at it occasionally. It hurts. Terribly. Enough to make me cry. Things really aren't all that bad in here. I don't have to worry about my poor credit anymore, at least. I just wish the whispers would stop. To anyone who reads this, listen to me. Do not move into... I hope you guys enjoyed tonight's story. If you did, be sure to hit a like. Or, if you want to support the channel, be sure to subscribe. Also, if you're looking to suggest any stories, you can find me over on my Discord in the link below. Anyways, guys, be careful out there, because you never know what's hiding in the dark.